Most people who end up in serious trouble at work don't wake up one day and decide to cross the line. It always happens slowly, under pressure, in noise, in small decisions that feel justified in the moment. And before you know it, you're somewhere you never thought you'd be. Today's guest lived that reality. She was a successful Wall Street lawyer who made a series of decisions that led to a federal prison sentence. Leadership today isn't just about scaling. It's about navigating constant uncertainty, market disruptions, and high-pressure decisions. If you're dealing with chaos, bottlenecks, and relentless pressure, welcome to the Business Emergency Room. Hey, I'm glad you're tuning in today. I am very excited about today's guest. Today, we're going to talk about the kind of stuff that you would always want to know more about. I'm talking today to Rashmi Airan, and she actually is a keynote speaker, a former Wall Street lawyer, and someone with a very remarkable story. She actually has some scars, some business emergency scars to speak from, and I'm very glad that you are willing to talk about that. And well, that's basically what you do today, right? You build success after that situation. You had a successful career in law and finance and then made a decision during the housing boom that basically led to a federal prison sentence. And you've turned that around. And today you help leaders and organizations understand how good people end up making bad decisions. Right, which we all do in life, just maybe not with the kind of consequences that it had for you. And so, yeah, perfect topic for the Business Emergency Room. What does it take to lead with greater awareness and accountability and resilience? So I'm very glad you're joining me today. Welcome, Rashmi.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here. I think it's such a fascinating title, the Business Emergency Room, because I think, we can all relate to that moment where you feel like you're in the ER and how are you going to come out of it? So I feel it deeply.
Yeah, it's a great analog, right? I know I'm not okay, but I'm also not sure where to start anymore. You often, very, very often talk about how good and capable people can end up making very bad decisions under pressure. And pressure feels like the norm these days. I used to work just with fast moving industries, but it seems to be more universal than ever. So from where you sit today, what are maybe some of the warning signs that someone is entering that danger zone where your maybe your normal ability to censor or filter or deploy some of the tactics that keep you on the safer side start to fail? What are some of the signals or symptoms that we should be on the lookout for?
Yeah, it's such a great question. So first I'll say that I agree with you. We are in a moment of time where pressure does feel like the absolute norm. Although I like to frame it differently, right? I don't like to see it as a negative thing. The world is full of excitement and energy around so many new technological tools, AI tools, digital tools, and then just access to information that we didn't have, which is allowing us to be more efficient, us to accomplish things faster. In that noise, as I call it, there's a lot of pressure and speed and sense of urgency that I think for those of us that are in a scenario as leaders leading either a team or an organization or even our families, sometimes it's easier to think, or it just happens in the moment where we just take a shortcut and we're not actually thinking about the decision that we're making. And so there's a lot of red flags I can go through from my own experience. You shared a little bit with your audience that I was so for those of you that don't know my story, I was a Wall Street investment banker. I ended up at an Ivy League law school, did very well. And then I ended up with my own practice. And about 7 years later, I got indicted for bank fraud, stemming from a real estate case. So I was a real estate attorney in transactions before the 2009 crisis. And not that this is an excuse, but just so I can give all of you context, I was married to a firefighter. I had 2 little children who were 2 and 3. I was a major breadwinner. I felt a lot of pressure to to do a lot of things, right? One was to continue to be in the rooms that I had worked so hard to be in, to keep up with the Joneses. Miami, I live in Miami. And so like keeping up with the appearances and the house and the car and all of the things that society tells us is like what the definition of success is. And I was absolutely caught up in that. Make my parents proud of me, fulfill the self-imposed expectations that I had of myself, and all of my entire self-worth and self-value and self-love. My whole life had been rooted in being that superstar achiever and making the money and getting the grades and getting the clients. And so it was within all of this context that when I get the opportunity in 2007, the heyday of real estate in South Florida, I jumped. Like I wanted this client so badly. And I was convinced that this was going to be the answer to the problems that I felt like I had, right? Because I was having marital problems. My kids were asking me, when am I coming home? Because I was just out there hustling in the noise of life, going to every possible networking dinner. I was missing dinners. Like, it was a very, it was navigating a lot of complicated obligations all at the same time and balancing it. And I think those of us that are parents understand this when we have little children at home. And so when I met this potential client, to me, it felt like the answer to all of my problems, right? It felt like I just need to land this one big client. And so in the haste of wanting to land the client and making him like me and making him want to work with me, he said things like, oh, we don't want to work with this one big law firm that we've been working with. We'd like to come work with you. Now, I was a solo entrepreneur with 4 people that worked for me. They were leaving a very large multinational law firm. So one of the things you just asked is like, what were the signs? Well, that should have been a huge red flag, right? I should have said, why would you leave a big law firm to work with me? I have less bandwidth, less experience, less people, right? But that's not what went on in my head. What went on in my head was, there's something special about me, right? You become arrogant. You convince yourself that you deserve it. So that was like one of those moments. The other next moment on that same day, basically what was happening was this real estate developer was giving buyer incentives to buyers to buy his units, which, by the way, almost every other developer was doing at that time in 2007. And I knew it was creative, but when I wanted to get approval from my underwriter, I walked into a side office, I called my underwriting counsel, and I essentially glossed over many of the facts. I thought to myself, well, all that matters is what's in and out of my escrow. And does a settlement statement show that? But a lot of this other fluff, like that doesn't matter if it's not, if it doesn't affect my file. And that's where the fraud was, because it was lack of disclosure. I had knowledge of a thing that I did not disclose. Come to find out 7 years later that this developer did all these other things outside of what I knew. But see, none of it mattered. It didn't matter that I didn't know any of that. It mattered that I knew this one thing, and that's enough. And we're held, as leaders, we are held to a higher standard. We're held to a fiduciary duty. We're held to ask the questions that are hard, walk away if we have to. And all of those things I didn't do. I just wanted this client, and I had convinced myself.
Yeah, and you paid a really dear price for, I think, something that happened maybe not the same way, but to so many others, right? In the years I've been going around, I've seen things that shouldn't have happened, right? And that if they were, sometimes it is within the rules of the own company, right? Or and so it doesn't get flagged with the same consequences and the same impact as you had. But these things happen, and they do get found out about, and dependent on where you sit in the ecosystem and who the party is that gets to judge that, it can be kept internal and end up with very different consequences. So what I like, well, thank you for elaborating a bit on the example, because I think it's such ultimately the barrier to eke into the wrong side of things in the haste and in the enthusiasm can be very low, right? And it is something that can happen to everybody, because in the moment when we're overloaded, our vision becomes more tunnel, right? So can you talk a little bit about your view on the decision making and what happens to our ability to make decisions when the pressure cooker is on?
Yeah. So I think what happens is, so I'll just preface this by saying, when I got home from prison in 2016, and the first thing, obviously, after I debriefed and spent time with my children, who were 9 and 10 at the time, I decided I needed to understand what went wrong. How did I, the little girl who was trying to be the perfect little Indian girl my whole life, who never colored outside the lines, who always was on this straight and narrow path, went to the best schools, got the grades, best family, great values, right? How did I, a good person, without really, I did not have bad intention, how did I make such bad decisions that landed me in federal prison? So I needed to understand it for myself, for my own peace. So I began to do a ton of research around behavioral ethics, the psychology of decision-making, cognitive biases, to understand. And so from a decade of research, what I have truly come to believe is that we are all caught in this potential moment where there's like there's an instant where it's a combination. It's like a what do I call it? A tornado, right? It's the moment where you have pressure and speed, and your competition is winning out or has just landed the client that you were trying to land, and the sense of urgency, and then the noise of everything else that we have going on in our life. Maybe our spouse is suffering from something, or our daughter is suffering from something, or going through something, right? And so in that sense, in that moment when we have to make a decision, an email comes in, and you read the line, you don't open the attachment, and this is what happened to me. I send it out thinking it's just this one time and it's not a big deal, and somebody else will read the attachment. How many of us have forwarded forwarded an email and not opened the attachment?
Yeah, for sure.
Right? We've all done it. Or have we or just not read the email all the way through, right? We just think somebody else will do it and let us know. Right. But I was the boss. Yeah. The buck stops with me. So when we're in that moment, I call it decision drift. Right. It's not a cliff. It's a drift. It's not like you just wake up one day and are like, I'm going to compromise my integrity today. That's not how it works. It's literally these moments of a sliding scale where you just sort of start drifting because out of convenience, or because you don't want the competition to win out, or because it's just like you said, haste and the enthusiasm to land the client.
Too busy, too overloaded,
everything.
Too of anything. Is definitely involved in all of it.
Yeah. And so what happens is, in order to avoid the drift, we have to begin to think about what is going on in our brain, in our minds. So there's a couple of things. One is we are often making reactive decisions because of our emotions. So like in my case, when I met this client, I was under this pressure. Underlying all that was fear, right? Fear of not making enough money, fear of not being able to pay for my kids, fear of not being enough, looking good enough, all of the fears, right? But I didn't call it fear. I called it ambition, being strategic, thinking outside the box. So I didn't name it as fear. And so I think our first challenge is, and what I say is there's a four-part process. I call it the clarity loop. It's a repeatable feedback loop. The first question is, what am I feeling right now? Because if you can actually have the awareness to name the emotion, I think this is the modern leadership challenge we have today. How can we start making better decisions by getting clarity? So first, awareness, name the emotion. What am I feeling right now? And actually, don't try to justify it. Just name it. Anger, jealousy, envy, fear. What is the emotion? Because then once you name the emotion, you don't actually make decisions from your emotions. You can stop. You interrupt the sequence.
We can immediately recognize that's a poor driver to make the decision in the moment, and that we even if it's a 30-second or a half a minute or 2 minute step back from things. Yeah. We immediately recognize then that something else might need to happen before if you're dive in head first.
Exactly, because when you're operating out of fear, you're not even thinking straight. You can't even think clearly because you're just so stuck in this fear mode. Once you recognize what's my emotion, the second question is, what story am I telling myself? So what happens is we have all sorts of stories that we're telling ourselves. And usually it falls under confirmation bias or self-serving bias or outcome bias, because we tell the stories that we want to hear, that we want to convince ourselves that are self-serving, that will produce the outcome that we have decided we want to achieve. So it becomes self-serving, and it just confirms the decision that we've already decided we want to make. So by asking yourself, what's the story I'm telling myself? You begin to recognize that you're actually just rationalizing and justifying what you would like to do. And you need to deconstruct that first.
Yeah,
The
and that's
third,
a safety thing, right? It's very logical that when you are in a heightened emotional state, that we do that anyway, right? We
yeah.
say these things to justify the decisions we make, to soothe ourselves. But you can imagine you do more of it, or need it more, when you're in a heightened emotional state, and in a somewhat negative emotional state, or one of the ones that don't make you feel great, at least. Huh?
Yeah, I think that those emotions drive our stories, right? So once we can have awareness of the emotion, we can then start to deconstruct the stories and have like conscious awareness of it. The third step is what matters most. So what ends up happening is we oftentimes we can believe we have the best core values, but in the moment, revenue becomes more important than your reputation, or winning the client becomes more important than your team culture that you spent years establishing and building. And when you can just like root back into what your values are, you can have clarity around the decision that you're about to make, and then not. So it's like having moral awareness and moral judgment about the decision you're about to make, and actually do what I call it an ethical reality check. And then the final step is, what can I own later? And that's where we begin to acknowledge and have accountability and acknowledge moral humility. Because moral humility starts with the simple acknowledgement, I am capable of drift. And if I'm capable of drift, I need guardrails around my thinking. I need a process, which is why I created this clarity loop. It requires you to imagine yourself in 5 years, in front of a boardroom, in front of your family, on the front page of a newspaper, having made that decision. Because most of us think that would never happen to me, or I'm wired differently. I have better values. I'm smarter. I know all the right people. There's so many things that we convince ourselves, and we think we're different than others, but we're not. We're all imperfect human beings capable of drift in the moment. And once we acknowledge that about ourselves, that changes the dynamic of how we start to make our decisions and how we lead.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing you say is not that you're advocating under pressure to not make decisions, right? Because I often, the subject of decision paralysis is a whole other subject, and it's not necessarily the same subject, right? But it's potentially a more common symptom in a business emergency than maybe people. Even more common than maybe people making bad decisions under pressure. I think not making a decision could count as a bad decision, and could equally have the similar consequences, right? So what you're saying is not, okay, I want you to stop making decisions. It's about making the best decision you can make in the moment, and that includes not just working through the mechanics of the decision, but also untangling how you as a decision maker are operating in that decision-making process.
Right, because what it is that there are internal and external factors affecting our decisions, and we have to be aware of what those factors are before you make the decision. So we have to make the decisions. That's part of leadership. We're constantly faced. We make 30,000 subconscious decisions a day. So it's not about avoiding the decision or taking like paralysis analysis. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying analyze it till death. I'm like stuck in meetings trying to get to a decision. That's not at all what this is. This is just helping a human being leading at work or at home or in their communities have a better process. And I call it the guardrails to our thinking to make better decisions. So I recently I was just talking to an organization last week. And one of the things I said was, you all in your organization, this is a very complex supply chain association. I said, you all in your businesses have guardrails for everything. You have guardrails for your HR, for your people. You have HR. You have guardrails for your technology. So you have cybersecurity and password controls and access control. You have guardrails for your processes, SOPs, compliance, guardrails for your outputs. So you have quality control and audits and all this stuff. But no one has guardrails around their thoughts, their communication. And so our thoughts are making the most consequential decisions for us, whether it's our actions, our behaviors. And so why not create guardrails for our thoughts so that it's essentially exactly what you do in every other aspect of your leadership and business. So we need So the clarity loop is your guardrail for your thoughts.
So those who tune in frequently know that decision making is definitely my most favorite subject, followed by risk management, which fits fair and square in this space. If I talk about decision making hygiene, then in larger organizations, particularly, right, I say to people, we don't have to make it very complex, but I want you to have a decision making process, a code rack, right? And there is some minimum elements it should have, which includes actually working through the reasoning of the decision making together, right? Not doing that in isolation so that it gets bounced off different people. And I've seen a process like that still lead to, the kind of scenarios that you talk about. But in my head, if you do that, if you involve more people in the decision making, even if they are all part of a leadership team that's equally under pressure, do you think if you put more people together, it's slightly easier to avoid really making the real bad decisions because you are working through it? Or if you're all in the same pressure cooker, that's not necessarily given. I think that's a really good
question. Because on the one hand, there's groupthink, and then there's like pressure to agree to, let's say there's a CEO, and then there's, the C-suite. So a C-suite might just want to agree with the CEO. I mean, it's obviously not their job, but obviously it happens. Same with the chair of a board and the board. I believe that every human is responsible for the decisions that they're making. And so to the extent that we have a process for every individual to make and think about the decision individually on their own, then that combined leads to better decisions. How teams make decisions, if like in my belief, is if they can begin, if all of our human beings, all of our leaders can start understanding how to keep guardrails around their thoughts and make the decisions. So then as a team, any decision that's going to be made will be filtered through this idea of guardrails. Yeah, I mean, because we're not going to avoid teams having to make decisions. It's part of
if we take it through your four steps, I would not assume that normally people are necessarily speaking out loud where they are on the emotional scale of how they're feeling about a certain decision. I do find that organizations where decision making is more transparent and more joint exercise, people will at least say things like, "Ooh, I really feel way out of my depth here," or I really am struggling with this one. Or people would quicker say, "Oh, this one is bringing me back to this bad situation." So to at least stand a chance that somebody else in the room might realize that there is more biases and more luggage coming to the table in that moment.
I think that's a really good point. So teams that have the capability to talk about, in this case, their emotions, what are the stories they're telling themselves, right? As they talk about it as a team and be more transparent and authentic, if whatever the potential bad decision that could be made will come up, and then most likely the consequences of those decisions can be discussed openly with courage, with understanding of what that could mean for the company, for the board, for the team, for the product. And I think that that's where we're lacking right now. There's this immediate need to jump, right? And to say yes, and to, honor the client, or keep up with whatever pricing. There's so many things that are going into the decisions that are happening. And if we can drill down a little bit more and have teams talk about it more, oh God, sorry, and have teams talk about it more, then I think that we're going to be in better shape as humans and as teams and as organizations.
Yeah. And open dialogue about the difficult is a win in any and all scenarios, right?
Yeah. I think the transparency is key. Yeah. I think so. So when we can sit in a meeting or sit in a team and have the courage to have a conversation around what's hard, like those difficult conversations, that's going to lead to a much better process for decisions, because then we're talking about what feels icky, I'm going to use an example. So do you remember the MCI WorldCom scandal?
No.
So the MCI WorldCom scandal, this was decades ago, probably 25 years ago at least. So I had a friend that was in the MCI WorldCom accounting department, and he, was an accountant. He gets a job. He's there. He gets to the job, and his bosses are like, "This is how we've always done the accounting here," and so he like reviews it, and he thinks to himself, it's not what I learned in business school. It doesn't seem right. And then he takes it to his boss, and his boss is like, "No, this is how we've always done it here." And like that's the moment, right? That's the moment where you either push back, or you're like, okay, I guess if that's how it's always done here, then I'm missing something, right?
Yeah.
Instead of listening to his gut, instead of like challenging and asking more questions, and his emotion was like fear of like, okay, I guess I don't know enough, or I'm scared if I say something, I'll get fired, and loss aversion is a thing. None of us want to lose anything. And so he went along with it. Ultimately, he was indicted, and along with lots of other people, and he served time. And so this happens in corporations without us intending it to be that. But how we're making decisions, if we're not paying attention, what we're going along with, because our boss says to do it, or a teammate who's been there longer says to do it, right? Those are all the things that are going to get us in trouble.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's really the hardest part, right? So in operation, so I come out of oil and gas background, of course, and so in safety we learn, or with safety in mind, we learn to intervene, and even when somebody's wellness is on the line, right? Somebody could get hurt or get killed, or you would think that intervening is easy, but even in that space, with people dynamics, cultural differences, hierarchies, it's so hard to intervene, and people need to learn that skill, and there's training for that. When we then go to business ethics, where the physical wounds or danger are so much harder to see, right? Or where people sometimes cannot wrap their head around what the actual consequences could be or would be, because it's maybe a little further out of things. I think intervening can be sometimes even harder if you're, if you're the one observing it, like the example you gave of your friend. Yet at the same time, as a bare minimum, you should learn from these situations and come up with a better game plan for the next time, right? And say like, hey, am I going to live with this over and over again?
Well, I think that's the point, right? I think that's why I do what I do, because I did make bad decisions. I didn't listen to my gut. I didn't pay attention to all the red flags, and I was making decisions out of what felt like necessity and haste, and the noise, and making my parents proud of me, and keeping up with the kids and the appearances. And, I think that all of that led to this like crisis moment for me, which didn't feel like crisis. At the time, it felt like a huge bonus. Like, oh my God, I've landed this huge client. I'm going to make all this money, and I don't have to go chasing other clients. And by the way,
the lottery.
Like I didn't feel like I didn't make a ton of money, but I made enough money to survive without having to go chase other clients. Right. But it's almost like when it's too good to be true, you really should question it. And that's, you hate to think that that's the case, but it is kind of the case. And so, I have just come to a place of understanding that no matter my education, no matter my family upbringing, no matter my values, that I made these decisions in the moment, and I don't justify it. I don't mitigate it. I know I made these bad decisions. And now my entire purpose now is to help others recognize that this also could happen if you're not paying attention, if you don't have the guardrails around your thoughts to apply a process, this, what I call the clarity loop, because we all need clarity. There's a lot of noise in the world right now. There's a lot of, we didn't even talk about the global climate of where we live right now. Just the world is unsettled. The world, I don't know if you saw this, but there was a recent study done that the world, perception of the world uncertainty and instability is higher than it's ever been, ever in the history of the world. more
Yeah,
than
and
the pandemic.
the World Economic Forum is even coming up with new terms to talk about also the level of interdependency that exists therein, right? That almost none of us in no industry and no business, we believe that we can kind of work within our cocoon, but it's just not true. Everything becomes more interdependent and more connected. And so we have potentially less control and more moving parts than ever.
And I feel like more than ever, like you said, we need to be thinking about what's possible if we don't pay attention, what's possible if we begin to react to our emotions. And the reality, of course, is that in my case, there were 500 other attorneys in Miami doing what I was doing. I'm the one that got indicted. So yes, the chances of you making a bad decision, getting away with it are pretty high. Yeah. But is that how you want to go to sleep at night?
Wow, and how many times, right?
Yeah,
it's like speeding or like anything else, at some point.
Tempting fate. Yeah. It's tempting fate. Yeah. So I feel like we get to the point where we need to just like have more clarity and then pause enough to ask ourselves these questions. So that we start making better decisions.
Yeah, and I love that, your phrase, what can I own later? And that can be a very private thought process, but I think such an important question to ask yourself, right? I could talk to you for 700 hours about this subject. There's so many other side roads we can get into. So I'm sure we have to have you back on another episode sometime to pursue more of these avenues. But this is what we have time for today. I am sure there's people listening who are like, I want to know more. I want to hear Rashmi speak. I want to find out where she's speaking next or where else I can find more about her. Where do they go? What do they do?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking. They can reach me. My website is my name. So it's www.rashmiairan.com. It's RASHMIAIRAN.com. I'm sure your show notes will have it. My email, feel free to email me. It's rashmi@rashmiairan.com. I'm everywhere on social except X. So I'm on LinkedIn, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram. Fairly active on all of those. LinkedIn probably the most. So feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, and you can follow me. I have a newsletter every Tuesday. My book is coming out. So depending on when you actually hear this podcast, my book will be out May 19, 2026. It's called All Rise, A Lawyer's Evolution from Prison to Purpose. Please buy it, share it, gift it, all those things. That's it.
Well, I'm so glad you joined me today. Yes, indeed, wherever you're picking up this podcast, you can go back in and in the show notes, find all the links, all the names, and the reference to the book. Rashmi and I met at a conference in Chicago. I heard you speak there, and you're speaking quite a lot these days. So maybe you have the good fortune to have Rashmi in your neck of the woods, or you can invite her to your event. She is a fabulous speaker and clearly a subject that will attract many, but also has lessons in there that I think are relevant for all of us. I am definitely going to rephrase that question to myself. What can I own later? I think that's a very useful way of putting it. So thank you for that. And thank you for joining me today, Rashmi.
Thank you so much for having me on. I was honored to be on. Thank you.
And thank you, listeners, to tuning in today. I hope to have you back on the next episode of the Business Emergency Room. That's it for this episode of the Business Emergency Room. If you are currently dealing with chaos or disruption in your business, please reach out. You can email, text, or call, and I will find a way to connect with you within 24 hours. I've helped others steer out of the storm, and I know I can help you too. Talk soon. Please like, subscribe, and share.